All right, welcome back. And in this lecture, we're going to kind of cover briefly the nutrient requirements of horses. Now, as review, again, we talked about, largest portion of annual costs after housing. So, a lot of my strategy too with students and horse owners is trying to protect their pocketbooks, that make sure you're not spending too much on your animal when you don't need to. And we tend to, especially here in the United States, we tend to overfeed our animals or overfeed the nutrients they require. So that's why covering nutrient requirements is so important. And we can see it in our obese pets everywhere, running around. Again, we talked about neglect, and a lot of that's just due to lack of knowledge. And then obesity is a problem in horses. So again, here it is. I've told you I was going to tell you. We're going to base how much we feed on the weight of the animal. And that last lecture talked about, how we can do that with the weight tape or do those measurements. And again, as review, we feed 2.5 to 3% of body weight per day. So what does that mean? So let's look at an example. It's very easy. Just use a 1,000-pound horse or 450-kilogram horse. So if we do 2.5 to 3% of body weight per day, that's going to be 25 to 30 pounds of feed per day. There you see it in kilograms. So that's a lot of food compared to what we eat. And I always recommend any horse owner have a scale in their barn. Like as you see in this picture here, they're weighing their hay. And one of the things we always say in the horse industry is, just feed them a flake of hay, because these hay bales, you can flake them apart, take that flake and just throw it to your horse. Well, I did an experiment once at an extension event where I was speaking to a lot of horse owners, and I said, okay, let's look at a flake of alfalfa versus a flake of coastal versus a flake of Timothy grass. And we took them, and I grabbed them, and actually I took a big flake and a small flake, and they varied anywhere from 4 pounds to 8 pounds per. So again, that's how it varies. That's why it's important to weigh out your feed before you do that. Now, we feed a forage-based diet. All diets in horses and any of the equids, donkeys, and the hybrids needs to be based in forage. And then we use grains or concentrates and fats and vitamin mineral mixes and all these other things to help meet their nutritional requirements if for whatever reason, as we'll see in the next few slides, that we can't meet it based on forage alone, which the reason these animals need that increase in their dietary requirements is generally because we're doing different things with them. We're exercising them, we're riding them, we're going over big jumps with them, we're doing dressage, dancing with them. So that increases their nutrient requirements. So with your feeding strategy, again, the weight of the animal is very important. Then it's also important to look at the stage of life, because in these images, this weanling right here, that's a weanling, is going to have very different requirements versus a yearling or a 2-year-old versus a mature horse. They're all going to have different nutrient requirements, just like us as growing humans. Our children, as they age, need more nutrients, more protein, other things in their diet. Okay, and then the other thing is activity. So if you have a horse that's just kind of a companion pet out on your pasture or out in front of your house somewhere, you don't need to feed them anything as long as that pasture is well maintained. Or let's say you don't have a pasture, you can just feed them hay. You don't really have to give them grain every day. You can meet their nutrient requirements just based on forage. But once we start to ride them and do some different activities, or we intensely exercise them and do some of these intense activities, we're definitely going to need to feed them more to meet their greater nutrient requirements. So, I'm going to kind of break down how I'm going to present this to you. And the first thing is digestible energy, or DE. And basically the easiest way to say this is it's calories. It's the fuel in the body. You have to think of, filling up the gas tank every day. We do it in our own diets. We eat, we get energy, our fuel tank, our body burns the energy. If we don't burn it all off, it gets stored as fat, or we just excrete it. We don't use them all, the nutrients. Or if we don't meet our nutrients and empty the tank, then we'll start, attacking our body reserves to meet those nutrient requirements. So it all starts with energy. In horses, we say this is megacals. So that's 1,000,000 calories per pound. Human diet, roughly what, 2,000, 2,500 calories per day. So these animals require a heck of a lot more energy than we do. And I, looked up, how to measure a calorie, and that's basically you take 1 gram of water and you increase it a degree Celsius. So that's where they get that measurement. That's just kind of a, interesting factoid. Now, the next thing we'll look at is diet proportions. So the energy in the diet, then the proportions between forage or hay versus concentrate or grain. So we're going to change those proportions as we get around, as the animal ages, and then different ways we use them. So just as an example, with, again, going back to that 1,000-pound animal, very easy to use, and let's say it's a 50-50 proportion diet. And so at 3% body weight per day, that means we would feed about 15 pounds or 6.75 kilograms of forage, so hay, or 15 pounds of concentrate or grain. Same thing, using the same thing. Now, if you have a very well-maintained pasture, you don't need to feed them hay. They will get that 15 pounds plus by grazing, so you don't have to worry about supplementing hay. And we'll get into pasture management and when you would supplement hay and those things in a later lecture. Okay, and then the other thing to consider in the diet is lysine. And you'll hear this, that lysine is the limiting amino acid in all equids. And basically what that means is the body cannot naturally produce it. All the other amino acids, the horse or donkey, they can produce it on their own. But this is the only one that they can't, and they need to get it from their diet. So they have to get this from their diet, and generally most of our forages and grains have it. So, all right, so that's kind of what we're going to cover with the different requirements. So let's jump into classes, or the different classes of horses, or as they age, and see what those requirements are. Now, looking at weanlings, these are the guys that, for the first 3 months, they've mainly gotten all of their nutrition from nursing from mom. They will graze a little bit, as those earlier behavior videos showed you, those cute smally ass foals, munching grass with mama. They will start to get some of those nutrients. But once they hit the 4 to 6 month age, this is where we do a thing called creep feeding, where we'll start to feed them some grain. And you can see these digestible energy requirements are really high. Their protein requirements, this is the highest of any class that we'll talk about, is the highest. And how we feed them is a 70% diet in concentrate or grain, and then a 30% diet in hay. So they're getting most of their nutrition from grain. Now, as they age, that's going to shift, as we'll see. So going on to the yearling, you can see that energy requirement. So yearling, or we call them long yearlings, the 18-month-olds, you can see that digestible energy has gone down from 1.45 to the weanlings to 1.3 and 1.15. And this is megacals per pound of feed. And then as that energy and protein requirement and even lysine requirement goes down, we start to shift these proportions to more of a forage-based diet. So even though they're still not on a more, they're on a either half or mostly grain diet, we start to shift to feeding these guys more energy through, more forage through hay and pasture. Now, I will say also that if these animals start to enter into training, then that is going to shift their requirements. They're going to get a little bit higher than they normally would. And we'll talk about working your animals here in a minute. But, typically horses around the 1.5 year age, certain disciplines will start exercising them routinely. Now, 2-year-old requirement, again, goes down, and we're shifting. Our protein requirement goes way down, and then we're shifting more to a hay-based diet or a forage-based diet. Now, as a mature, so we consider a 3-year-old or old, 3 years and older as a mature horse. You can see here 0 concentrate, 0 grain. So if you have this animal that's just out on pasture or really not doing anything with them, they can be maintained on purely forage-based diet. Now, if they start to lose a little bit of body condition, then you would want to introduce some more concentrate to increase the digestible energy here. Okay, and also their protein requirement here. Okay, now stallions, now this isn't geldings, these are intact boys, need a little bit more because we all know boys are weird, right? Here we are. Because we're definitely a little bit more energetic. And what's a stallion doing? They're running up and down the fence most of the time. They're whistling at the girls. Hey, look at me, you know, over here. And he's trying to get their attention. So he's burning a lot more calories every day. And so that's why their diet shifts to a little bit more concentrate. They're feeding a little bit more protein, a little bit more energy. And that's again to maintain condition, you know, maintain their body condition. All right, now we'll get into some of the special classes, and one of those is definitely pregnant mares. And the pregnant mare gestation, which we'll cover in the last week when we get into more repro, is 11 months, so 340 days, pretty long. And the growth curve of a fetus is pretty low those first couple trimesters, and then towards those last 3 months, it really peaks. I mean, really goes up really big. So that's where the foal really gains a lot of its growth, and so consequently it's putting a little bit more demands on mom. So you can see as they get later in gestation, and parturition would be after that 11 month, you know, as they go down, their energy requirements are going up here, and we shift more to feeding a little bit more concentrate. They need a little bit more protein, a little bit more lysine, okay? Now, lactation, I always like to say, is probably one of the most energy demanding times in a mare's life. And that's because she is taking all of her stored nutrients on top of her diet and producing milk for those foals. So if you go back to our body condition scoring system, that's why we say mares should be, brood mares that are producing foals should be in a 6.5 because they're going to lose some weight during that lactation cycle. So you can see in those first few months, first 3 months, it's a 50-50 diet, and they have really high protein requirements, high energy requirements. So you're feeding her as much as you safely can to meet those energy needs to produce lactation. Now, as that foal nurses less and gets more nutrients from other sources in its diet, it's putting less pressure on mom to produce milk. So she won't drop as much weight. Now, the final class is talking about working horses, and again, this is something that you'd have to play with your individual animal. Again, individual metabolism comes into play, but what I consider light or moderate work, some people may say that's really heavy work or whatnot. So, what I would consider light work is just occasional riding. You're really not pushing the animal too much. Just doing some pleasure riding, or riding out down some trails, maybe not so heavy. So you're still a predominantly forage-based diet. So you can see 65% there. Now, as you get into more moderate work, everyday work, or really intense work like polo ponies and these endurance riders or thoroughbreds on the racetrack, you're feeding more of a concentrate diet versus a hay diet. So this is probably one of the few classes where you would see feeding a lot more grain than hay in any horses. And when I worked on the racetrack, we fed them a ton of grain, and it seemed like it was still like when I went back to body condition scoring, those young thoroughbreds really they looked skinny to me. I mean, because it's so hard to keep condition on them, even though we were feeding them a very energy dense diet. So again, something you're going to have to play with on your own, with your own individual animal. Now, I'll give you some final tips. Like I've been saying, these animals' metabolism, varies. So you'll hear things in the horse industry like, it's a hard keeper or it's an easy keeper. Hard keeper means it's an animal with a very quick metabolism. They're really hard to keep weight on. So there's different strategies, feeding more fat, more energy dense diets to try to keep weight on, versus the easy keeper, which I hear quite a lot, especially with obese animals. This animal is an easy keeper, meaning I'm just feeding them hay, and they're still putting on weight. And we see this with donkeys too, because donkeys, put on weight generally relatively easily. So there's different strategies you can do, reduce the type of hay you're feeding, or some people soak hay to get some of those nutrients leached out, or those carbohydrates, really, those simple sugars to get leached out. So you'll hear that, and you have to make sure you're aware of that. So again, if they're losing fat, losing condition, you want to increase the energy in the diet, or if they're gaining, you want to decrease energy in the diet. And again, we're feeding more fiber and fat, less carbohydrates, so less simple sugars like corn-based diets and some of these other grains. We really want to focus more on fiber and fat, less carbohydrate, because of some of these nutrient disorders we're seeing. So in the next lecture, we're going to kind of break down the components of a diet, and I'll kind of walk you through what we feed and talking about a forage, grains, and then some of the supplements that we do feed, and talk briefly about adding fat to the diet to put on weight. See you then.